Some people pitch a fit when I start asking who wrote those marvelous plays. They tell me to shut my trap, that they don't want to flap, nothing to unwrap about no authorship mystery. Truly, though, a merchant in grain who wrote knavery, as with Richard III, though Henry V is possibly worse. And in comedy, how about Dogberry and the Dromios and Juliet's nurse? Shakespeare is infinite, Shakespeare's illiterate. Something here doesn't fit the Stratford story. Someone illuminate me. As for tragedy, there's Mark Antony. Lear and Hamlet are absolute gold. Puck is magical, but most tragical is the rubbish we have been told. Something just won't cohere, Stratford's a myth, I fear. Who is this Earl de Vere that I've heard of? Someone illuminate me. In those plays, I want illumination.
Hello, friends. This is a special episode of Shakespeare Illuminated, it says here. But aren't they all? Special insofar as we will not this time be examining a particular play, but rather addressing an issue requested by several viewers of previous episodes when I mentioned the influence of Chaucer on Shakespeare, that is, on the Earl of Oxford, using the pen name Shakespeare. Ooh, tell us more about that, came the messages in chat and to me afterwards. Okay, your humble servant, Michael Delahoyde, professor of English and people pleaser. Stop laughing. Here we continue to irk and undermine orthodox Shakespeare studies with the truth. Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, wrote the works ascribed to Shakespeare, for which the illiterate grain merchant Shakespeare of Stratford has been given credit. This is the best answer to the long-standing so-called Shakespeare Authorship Question. For much more on this perspective, check out the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship's website, Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, all one word, .org, and or my own website, Michael Delahoyde, all one word, .org. As always, I need to warn about this perspective. It is lamentably typical to encounter hostility and even retaliation when merely raising the question of authorship. But if the potential for joy in Shakespeare was scraped out of you in high school, you may finally find it here in our discoveries and in your own. This time I want to show you how influenced Shakespeare Oxford was by the so-called father of English poetry, Chaucer. How subtly he infused his plays with Chaucerianisms, and ultimately the implications of Shakespeare never mentioning Chaucer. It gets dark. If you do have a question, you can hit that Q&A button you should be seeing below. If I do not address these during this show, stick around for a Q&A immediately following. And meanwhile, you can enter general informal comments into chat, as you're already doing, which I'll try to keep an eye on too. All right, let's go. Shakespeare and Chaucer are the two big names in early English literature. And when I was a Chaucerian, I thought the names that I was encountering among the scholars, Kittredge, Loomis, and the others, they were Chaucerians. When I was thrust into Shakespeare and looked at the scholars there, the ones from 100 years ago, turned out to be the same names, Kittredge, Loomis, Bevington. And I realized, all right, long ago, you were an expert in early English literature. And then academia went through a phase where you had to specialize. But because I had that grounding in Chaucer and now thoroughly in Shakespeare, I was able to see some connections that I think get missed if you're just in a silo of your one or another specific disciplines. So the question, though, is why doesn't Shakespeare mention Chaucer ever? Well, he borrows wholesale. Two of the Chaucer works, Troilus and Cressida, becomes Troilus and Cressida. Very different in tone and everything else, but it is the story. And the Knight's Tale in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales becomes Two Noble Kinsmen in Shakespeare. But other than that, why isn't there more Chaucer? And why isn't Chaucer mentioned right where he should be? Shakespeare has no problem even putting Ovid as a prop on the stage in Titus Andronicus. And other poets get mentioned too, and other minor characters, as I'll mention later. But where is Chaucer? My academic grandfather, that is my mentor's mentor, E. Talbot Donaldson, was one of those early English scholars. And he seems to have done most of the work that was done on comparing Chaucer and his influence on Shakespeare. And there's one of his books. Donaldson says, until Marlowe and Spenser, almost in his own time, there were no poets in English besides Chaucer who had anything to teach him. And I got to say, Marlowe and Spenser don't cut it either. It really ends up being more Chaucer. You go through your English studies thinking the Norton Anthology or another anthology of English literature is a bunch of the greatest hits. You read Beowulf and maybe some other Anglo-Saxon poetry and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and eventually you'll get up into the Renaissance and Chaucer and all that. And you think, okay, that's a nice greatest hits collection. But it turns out there's actually a scheme in all of this, it seems, almost mystically. In other words, it all heads towards Oxford as Shakespeare. So one of young Oxford's tutors, Lawrence Noel, owned the Beowulf manuscript. Okay, no guarantees of anything there. Except I noticed that there's a swimming contest mentioned in Julius Caesar. It's not in Plutarch. It's just one of these little incidents that Cassius mentions to Brutus to try to tear down the reputation of Caesar. See, he lost a swimming contest. Oh, he had an epileptic fit in the middle of the river and, was begging like a little girl for help. And we're supposed to think that that makes him unworthy as a leader. Well, the same kind of swimming contest failure is launched as an accusation at Beowulf by this seemingly disgruntled courtier when Beowulf shows up to save Hrothgar in his hall from the evils and the murderousness of Grendel. And Beowulf has to say, yeah, well, okay, maybe I came in second in the swimming contest, but I was battling sea dragons and saving my cousin and all this other stuff. So he defends his honor there too. Is that an echo from Beowulf on the part of Shakespeare and Julius Caesar? Maybe. The Gawain manuscript, this is another glorious tale, has been linked with Robert de Vere, the 11th Earl of Oxford, probably commissioned by him or owned by him. But in any case, this is a de Vere that gets excised from the Shakespeare works too, because he was one of those flatterers of Richard II, and that was an awkward little bit. So we don't want to hear too much about him in the plays. But Richard II is the play that should be where we find Chaucer. As for Chaucer himself, the most glorious manuscript that we've got is called the Ellesmere manuscript. The de Vere family owned it. They probably commissioned the thing. So that was in the family. I don't think it was there when de Vere, our de Vere, the 17th Earl, was operating, but he's got that connection. And of course, eventually, Chaucer's called the father of English poetry or the father of English literature. So indeed, there's something to learn from him. I'll just mention the other main works of Chaucer, even though they're called minor poems. They're not the really short things. The Book of the Duchess, I'll have something to say about soon. The House of Fame. The Parliament of Fowls is a blast because it's a bunch of birds holding a political meeting to decide some kind of marriage. Troilus and Cressida, we know, and The Legend of Good Women. It seems like Chaucer might have gotten in trouble with Troilus and Cressida because it's the story of the worst, most unreliable woman ever, which makes me wonder why Toyota in the 80s named a car the Cressida. But in any case, the legend of good women might have been his penance when the queen or somebody said, you know, how about some good women for a change instead of her? And then he drags himself through his assignment and then can't help but goof it up. It's not really a legend of good women. It's a legend of a lot of women crying on the shores because their men jilted them. Or you got Cleopatra in there, who's typically not considered, you know, a real virtuous piece. Um, and then, of course, the Canterbury Tales. Now, I'm going to show you something here. This picture of Chaucer, one of the reasons the Ellesmere manuscript is so valuable is not just because it's the one with those margin illuminations of the pilgrims, but the Chaucer illumination, because he depicts himself as a kind of a bungling persona inside the pilgrimage. He just kind of likes everybody, has no critical thinking skills. But of course, that's a persona for Chaucer, the poet. But why is he so dwarfed down below and his horse is so small when the other pilgrims seem in proportion? The thinking here is that this is really valuable. Of course, he didn't look like that. Of course, he had a bigger horse, but that we have two artists going on here. One was brought in because maybe he knew exactly what Chaucer looked like, and he does the Chaucer bit. Then the horse guy comes in and says, you know, you didn't even leave me enough room here. What am I going to do? And he just crams in the rest. So the value is that that seems like maybe it's a valid illustration of what the real Chaucer looked like. But back to Shakespeare. How does he know anything about Chaucer, as I'll show? Vernacular literature was not read at school. There's no sure way of ascertaining when, how, and what variety of middle-class schoolboy might have come across English books. And for the most part, we're thrown back on the internal evidence of the plays themselves in our circular, typical fashion. What? He didn't learn Chaucer in the one-room schoolhouse for boys of all ages when it wasn't lamb birthing season? Huh. We know that Oxford had his Chaucer, purchased with some other valuable bits from the time. And as I say, the Ellesmere manuscript is one of the key links here with Chaucer. In the early suspected EO, or Earl of Oxford poetry, the lyric poetry that's coming out earlier in the Elizabethan period, like The Hundred Sundry Flowers, some of the suspected EO poems are very influenced by Chaucer directly. In the introduction to this, whoever wrote it, we get a tribute. The more pity that amongst so many toward wits had no one hath been hitherto encouraged to follow the trace of that worthy and famous knight, Sir Geoffrey Chaucer, and after many pretty devices spent in youth for the obtaining a worthy victory, might consume and consummate his age in describing the right pathway to perfect felicity with the due preservation of the same. Chaucer's mentioned as the inspiration, and not just for an individual poet, but we've got to follow as a nation Chaucer. And the hint is if we want to put England back on the map, give us a Renaissance. It's been going on in Italy for 200 years. Where is England? And I didn't realize until a couple days ago that I actually wrote all about this some years ago, the evolution from Chaucer and into the lyric poetry of Shakespeare. I want to focus on the plays today, so I'm not going to go into all the many dozens and dozens of echoes in those early suspected EO poems and elsewhere. But it is available if you want to go back and read that or access it. But on to plays generally. In Titus Andronicus, we hear completely arbitrarily about the emperor's court being like the house of fame, a palace full of tongues and eyes and ears. Surely any courtier's experience when all political tensions are focused on the court. But to call it the house of fame is a direct echo of Chaucer. And in the house of fame, you get these phrases which may or may not be creeping into the works of Chaucer. The white and red could come from anywhere. The Wars of the Roses, Elizabeth's rose symbol. But concerned about Sinon in Lucrece, the slaying of King Priam in Hamlet, who wants to see that enacted. Tempests, all that, all gold, not all gold that glareth, all that glistens is not gold. But that is done, it is not to do, what's done cannot be undone, and all the permutations of that in Macbeth. And those are kind of vague echoes, they might be accidental, but it gets more specific. In Romeo and Juliet, Benvolio says, "And I were so apt to quarrel as thou art, any man should buy the fee simple of my life for an hour and a quarter." Uh, the fee simple? Oh, simple, puns Mercutio a little bit. Fee simple is a legal term, which means just outright ownership. But it comes from Chaucer. All was fee simple to him in effect. His purchasing might not be in effect. And why does it come from him? Because it's a legal term? Because Chaucer makes a snide little pun about this character, the man of law. When he says all was fee simple, doesn't that sound like he means all was simply fee to him? It was all about money to this guy. His purchasing might not be in fact. His purchasing you couldn't even question. Or his purchasing might not be corrupt. This is a famous bit. "I am but mad north-northwest," says Hamlet. "When the wind is southerly, I know a hawk from a handsaw." And first, we've got the mad north-northwest. And the best Oxfordians have done is say Oxford would have been driven mad by the money he dumped into that Northwest expedition and lost it all. So maybe that's what Hamlet means. The other part of this, when the wind is southerly, I know a hawk from a handsaw, but a hawk, you think, oh, that's a bird, and a handsaw is a tool. So that's just like more crazy stuff from Hamlet and his antic disposition. But a hawk can also be a tool, a woodworking tool, and a handsaw is another word for the heron or hornshaw. And so he knows a bird from a tool, and he knows a tool bird from a bird tool, and it's just absolutely crazy. But check this out. In Chaucer, in Parliament of Fowls, there's a reference to Cytherea. This is Venus. We're talking both about the goddess and the planet together. But in terms of the planet, I saw the north-northwest when I began to write my dream. And this has been a Chaucerian problem because from the vantage point of England, Venus can never be seen north-northwest, not that north. So it's been an enigma for Chaucerians. And then you go to Shakespeare, and it's an enigma there too, borrowed in its enigmatic qualities from Chaucer. Pretty nifty. The nurse in Romeo and Juliet. "Did you ne'er hear say, two may keep counsel, putting one away?" That sounds grim. Two people can keep a secret if one of them's offed. But if two and one are treated differently, we've got a lot going on between this play and Chaucer's Pardoner's Tale. I'll explain. Father Lawrence says, "The earth its nature's mother is her tomb. What is her burying grave? That is her womb." It's a common trope, but add in the fact that in this apothecary scene, which seems notorious for being extraneous here, witness Shakespeare in Love. Why do we have an apothecary in here? He's called a caitiff wretch when Romeo's shopping around for poison. And in Chaucer's Pardoner's Tale, you've got a restless caitiff. Now, the difference is in the Pardoner's Tale, there are these three young, riotous, drunken idiots who think, hey, this death is like killing all our friends. Let's go out and kill death. Yeah, let's get him. So they go out and they meet this horrible old withered man with a cane banging on the ground, asking, "Mother, let me in." He wants to die and be in the grave, like that earlier quotation associated with the opening up in the grave. And he's considered a restless caitiff wandering along. Well, this apothecary, this weird apothecary in Romeo and Juliet, well, why is he called a caitiff wretch when he's a shop owner And in Chaucer's Partner's Tale, what happens is these three young men are told by this old man, go up to that oak tree at the top of the hill there, and you will find death. And they say, okay, yeah, let's go get him. So the three go up, they find this enormous treasure right there, and they say Yahoo, and they don't bother with the pursuit of this personification of death anymore. They say, hey, you, young guy, go back into town. Here, take some coins and buy us some food and drink, and we're going to come back. We're going to party after this celebration. Um, the young guy goes, and when he's gone, the two say, you know what? If when he comes back, we knock him off, there's more money for us. Yeah, let's do it. Meanwhile, the young one who's back in town goes to an apothecary who supplies some poison because he's got the plan of getting all the money himself. So when he goes back and poisons the food, they'll eat it and everything will be his. Well, of course, he goes back, they eat, they die, he dies, there are murders all over the place, and they found death. Check this out. The partner in introducing this tale starts preaching against absolutely everything like swearing and whoring and gluttony and all the rest. And here he seems to be talking about gluttony, preaching against it. Oh, womb, oh, belly, oh, stinking cod, fulfilled of dung and of corruption. At either end of thee, foul is the sound. How great labor and cost is thee to find. These cooks, how they stamp and strain and grind and turn substance into accident to fulfill all thy lecherous talent. Out of the hard bones knock they the marrow, for they cast naught away that may go through the gullet soft and sweet. Of spicery, of leaf, of bark, and root shall be his sauce, he maked by delight to make him yet a newer appetite. So you eat all this stuff, and all that's going to happen is 2 hours later, you're going to be hungry again. But what if you look at this again and think, okay, people intertwine wombs and bellies and all that all the time, but like little Brianna is growing in mommy's belly. Well, not really. But what if he meant womb too? What if the womb is the stinking bag filled with dung and corruption? Oh no. Are you talking about little Brianna? At either end of thee foul is the sound. There are these cooks straining and stamping and grinding. Ew, to fulfill thy lecherous talent. What if is lecherous literally? Out of the hard bones knock they the marrow. Ew, that may go through the gullet soft and swoop. Ew. And all you end up with is little Brianna, a newer appetite. So this is the partner's pretty dark view of children and procreation, as well as the more surface appearance of it being against gluttony. When Romeo goes to the tomb of Juliet, he refers to the tomb as a detestable maw, a womb of death, gorged with the dearest morsel of the earth. Thus I enforce thy rotten jaws to open, and in despite I'll cram thee with more food. And that blur of lives and bodies and death and wombs and stomachs and the rest seems to be inspired also here. So this partner has this extraneous apothecary who's called a beggar in Chaucer, but he owns a shop. So why is that? Except that we're thinking in these cross artist terms, Chaucer and Shakespeare. All right, here's some more from other plays. In the Tale of Sir Topas, this is Chaucer the Pilgrim's own tale in the Canterbury Tales. It sucks. It is a send up of just bad, bad literature. And he assigns it to himself, of course, because of the humility involved and the double joke involved in it. But Sir Topas is a very irresponsible and goofy little knight, says, me dreamed all this night, pardon, an elf queen shall my lemon be, my lover, and sleep under my gore, under my blanket. And it's considered pretty irresponsible romance dreaming there. But it's been suggested that isn't there an echo here of A Midsummer Night's Dream when we're having our dreamy affair with an elf queen? Titania. Here's one that drives me nuts. Falstaff calls the hostess in Henry IV, Part 1, Dame Partlet. And you look at the footnotes for most editions, and they'll say, that's a traditional name for a hen. Oh, okay, that explains it. Give me a break. A traditional name for a hen is going to be, in the Middle Ages, if you're a farmer, Sunday dinner. You don't give your chickens names. Now, I do because I respect my chickens, but not all of them because I can't tell two of the black ones apart and two of the red ones apart. So I have a couple names for them, but this is not the place for my chickens. But what's this Dame Partlet, a traditional name for a hen? Now, Pertelote comes from the Nun's Priest Tale, where Chaucer has this obscure character tell this glorious story about a rooster and his dame, his favorite chicken sister wife. Where is Chaucer? This is an image that shows Chaucer entertaining the court. So he must have read his works. Not sure to what extent he turned this into a kind of a reader's theater or inhabited the characters or used goofy voices or whatever, but it seems like maybe Chaucer was heading towards Shakespeareanism. That is, he starts out early in the French version of lyric poetry, imitating that. And then he has this brief Italian period where he's doing diplomatic missions there. But then it all turns very English. And it becomes more dramatic too. Now we've got characters telling their own stories, putting forth their own personalities. Something that we hadn't seen before. So Harold Bloom may say that Chaucer invented the human, but he had some help along the way with Chaucer. The disturbing thing here is that Richard II would be listening to him, but somebody has smudged out Richard's face there. And I'll tell you why. So all these characters come into full fruition when it's Shakespeare. But the whole idea of characters and interacting, which is the best part of the Canterbury Tales, that comes from Chaucer. As I say, Richard II, the play, that should be where we get some mention of Chaucer. Richard II was Chaucer's king. As you see, he was the entertainer in the court and seems like he was highly valued. Here is Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt, who comes off as a sterling character and a spokesperson for the glories of England in the Shakespeare plays. And here is his famous speech about England, read by our friend Tom Woosnam.
This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England.
And those glorious lines you can find in old school anthologies of English literature. You can find it at the end of a patriotic Sherlock Holmes movie from the 1940s before the Nazis got the boot. And it's thoroughly beloved. Of course, in continuing this in the play, it's a little more grim. It is leased now, this England, I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm. And then all the problems with Richard come into play. John of Gaunt, can sick men play so nicely with their names, asks Richard, because of the gauntness, apparently. No, misery makes sport to mock itself, since thou dost seek to kill my name in me. I mock my name, great king, to flatter thee. Well, there's concern about names here, and of course, in the authorship question, um, playing with your name and then obliterating your name, those are concerns. But it also seems to be active in Richard II, because this talk about names, once again, I'm thinking this is where there should be at least an oblique reference to Chaucer. But where is he? John Gower is a secondary or tertiary poet in Richard's court, and yet he's the chorus in Pericles. Who ever heard of John Gower otherwise? In Henry IV, Part 2, where seems like Chaucer might still be alive historically, we hear Shallow referring to the same, Sir John. He's talking to Falstaff, the very same. I see him break Scoggins' head at the court gate when he was a crack not thus high. Completely extraneous and bizarre. But there is a Scoggin. Chaucer's Envoy to Scoggin is a poem that nobody knows what to do with. It's kind of witty. But Scoggin, historically, if we've got the right one, was the tutor to Henry IV's sons, so including Prince Hal. And Chaucer seems to be appealing to Scoggin to maybe put in a good word and promises that I'm not going to write anymore, like he was in trouble for it. So it's all very buoyant and high-spirited, but it's potentially dark if this is in the later days and the new king has come in and booted Richard II. Chaucer, associated with Richard II and some other political matters, might have had reason to worry. The Tale of Sir Topas, as I mentioned, is Chaucer's assignment to himself and bungled. And then in Twelfth Night, you get this reference to Sir Topas. Now, I'm not even sure that Sir is an appropriate term for a priest in Twelfth Night, but we're borrowing it and calling him Sir Topas when he's going to badger Malvolio in the Dark House. It's thoroughly extraneous because afterwards, even Sir Toby says, well, you might have done it without the disguise because he couldn't see you anyway. So why did we come up with this character? Well, Chaucer comes up with his persona, inhabits that persona as a pilgrim, and then that pilgrim tells a tale of this Sir Topas. In the play, Shakespeare creates this character, Feste, clearly inhabits that character, and then that character creates another character and calls him Sir Topas. So pretty convoluted, but also pretty interesting. And yet, where is Chaucer? Now, this slide I left in from a long time ago. It's a tribute to Sam Saunders, the late Sam Saunders, because he was an old school guy and he had to memorize the first 18 lines of the Canterbury Tales. And so we miss him. But here we go. These now finally are the first famous 18 lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And again, our friend Tom Woosnam will give us the Chaucer.
One that apre with his shores soter, the draught of March hath persed to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which virtue engendered is the floor. When Zephyrus, eke with his sweete breath, inspired hath in every wheaten heath, the tendre croppes and the jongen zonne hath in the ram his hera corsirone. And smalle fowles maak melodieë that sleep in al the nik met open ear. So prikken hem naturen hier courages, and longen folk to go pilgrimages, and palmeres for to seken stronge strondes, to ferne holles, God hen sondre londes, and specially from every sheere zender of Engeland to Canterbury diewende. The holy blissful martyr for to seke that hem hath holpen, one that they was seke.
All right. Splendid. What does it mean?
One that apre with his shores sota,
When April, with its sweet showers,
the draught of March hath pierced to the rota,
has pierced to the root the drought of March,
and bathed every vine in switch liqueur,
and bathed every vein of the plants in such liquid
of which virtue engendered is the flower.
by which power the flower is created.
When Zephyrus ec with his sweet breath,
When the west wind also with its sweet breath
inspired hath in every wheaten heath,
in every grove and field has breathed life into it,
the tender croppers and the jonge zone,
the tender crops, and the young sun
hath the ram his kyra cursi rona,
has run half its course in Aries. This is the vernal equinox, so it's the start of the new year.
and smalle fowles maak melodie,
And small birds make melody,
that slepen all the nick met open ear.
that sleep all the night with open eyes.
So prikken hem naturen hier courages,
So nature incites them in their hearts.
dan longen folk to go pilgrimages,
Then folks want to go on pilgrimages.
and palmer is for to second stronge strondes,
And professional pilgrims carrying the palm to seek strange tracts of land or shores,
to verre holles god en sondre londes,
to distant shrines known in various lands,
and specially from every shires ende
and especially from every shire's end,
of Engeland to Canterbury die wende,
every shire's end of England to Canterbury they go,
the holy blissful mater for to seke,
to seek the holy blessed martyr, that's Thomas à Becket,
that hem hath holpen, one that they were seke.
because he's helped them when they have been sick. All right, those lines are expressive of an absolute ideal, a worldview that first is in the reverie tradition, the regreening tradition. So if you've got a medieval poem that begins with birds or spring or leaves or nature, you can bet this is going to end up being a love poem. Chaucer extends it further in this chain of awakenings, starts with nature, then the birds, and eventually the people, and even to the end of this 18-line vision is we end spiritually here too. So it's expressive of an ideal. Now, in the Canterbury Tales, the very next line is going to be everything was chance, and there were 29 pilgrims, and there's no meaning in it, and we just happened to meet at a tavern. So we don't know whether Chaucer's aligning himself with this ideal vision or the chaos of real life. Let's get back to Richard II. As I keep saying, Richard should have mentioned Chaucer. Chaucer should have had a nod here. This is the play where Shakespeare says the most about that perspective art, where you can find other utterances and admiration of this optical illusion art that the Elizabethans were playing around with. So these perspectives where you gaze rightly upon it from one way and it just seems like confusion, but you position yourself differently and eye it for another way. Like those optic games there used to be so popular where, you look at it and all you see is dots, but, your nephew can see, oh yeah, it's like a farmyard and there's a goat over there. What? Well, that's the idea with perspectives. But Shakespeare has done a good bit more with this idea of perspectives and looking at things from different angles. And so here we have John of Gaunt again. This is actually when we first hear of this nobleman, this admired fellow who was both brother-in-law and patron to Chaucer, during the years that Chaucer was in the court at Richard II's. So here there is reference to a recent apparent murder or suspicious circumstances against one of Gaunt's brothers, one of the royal princes, after Edward III is gone and now Richard II is in charge.
Alas, the part I had in Gloucester's blood doth more solicit me than Yorick's claims to stir against the butchers of his life. But since correction lieth in those hands which made the fault that we cannot correct, put we our quarrel to the will of heaven, who, when they see the hours ripe on earth, will rain hot vengeance on offenders' heads.
And I don't know what put it into my head, but something about the rain there at the very beginning and it being John of Gaunt, and maybe I'm just kind of hoping to find some Chaucer there. So when I saw rain, it might mean a different thing to Chaucer, but that first line, the sweet showers, the shores sota, somehow came to my mind. So I kept looking. Here's some more as Gaunt continues, or his sister-in-law responds.
Finds brotherhood in thee no sharper spur? Hath love in thy old blood no living fire? Edward's 7 sons, whereof thyself art one, were as 7 vials of his sacred blood, of 7 fair branches springing from one root. Some of those 7 are dried by nature's course, some of those branches by the destinies cut. But Thomas, my dear lord, my life, my Gloucester, one viol full of Edward's sacred blood, one flourishing branch of his most royal root, is cracked, and all the precious liquor spilt, is hacked down, and his summer leaves all vaded by envy's hand and murder's bloody axe.
Obviously, this is not the ideal world of Chaucer, but it's echoed again and again with that mention of root and the drought. We're not talking about nature here exactly. We're talking about the blood of the veins, not the veins of the leaves. And liquor. I'm not sure how common liquor is a word to substitute for liquid, but it may be telling that both Chaucer uses it and then Shakespeare takes it up. And this continues one more round.
Ah, Gaunt, his blood was thine. That bed, that womb, that metal, that self-mold, that fashioned thee, made him a man. And though thou liv'st and breath'st, yet art thou slain in him. Thou dost consent in some large measure to thy father's death, in that thou seest thy wretched brother die, who was the model of thy father's life.
Again, the sense is much darker, but we still get these echoes from those first famous 18 lines about breath, engendering, and this is a standard pun, but the young sun in the sky for Chaucer becomes the sun in the family here. All right, that might be dismissed as me looking too hard. Soon in the same act, we've got birds singing, maybe with open ear, like the small fools making melody. And Henry, when he's banished, he kneels to King Richard, saying oddly, Mowbray and myself are like 2 men that vow a long and weary pilgrimage. And I ask, how is banishment into exile in any way like a pilgrimage to a sacred shrine, unless Shakespeare wants that word in there, and he does. Because we keep hearing an enforced pilgrimage, he means banishment. Gaunt says to Richard, thou canst help time to furrow me with age, but stop no wrinkle in his pilgrimage. That's metaphoric. When Gaunt dies, Richard says his time is spent, our pilgrimage must be. Pilgrimage? He means war with Ireland. That's not a pilgrimage. But Shakespeare keeps wanting pilgrimage, pilgrimage, pilgrimage into this play. At the end of Richard II, Richard's in prison. Henry says, "Have I no friend who will rid me of this living fear?" And his goons interpret this as meaning, oh, he wants Richard dead. Let's go do it. Though he never said that. Maybe that's echoing Henry II's asking about Thomas à Becket, the holy blissful martyr. Will no man rid me of this meddlesome priest? Hang Mike Pence. At the end of the play, very end of the play, Henry IV says, "Come mourn with me for what I do lament, and put on sullen black incontinent. I'll make a voyage to the Holy Land to wash this blood off from my guilty hand." So he seems maybe hypocritically to be accepting responsibility for the death of Richard. But if he's going to the Holy Land to wash his blood off, isn't that a pilgrimage? And he calls it a voyage. So that violation of the logic of those words does say something very grim about the world we now live in with Henry IV. All right. It was as if in those passages that we just heard, uh, Shakespeare is practicing what comes into full fruition at the very start of Henry IV, the first part, his own play. Here's what he says.
So shaken as we are, so wan with care, find we a time for frighted peace to pent, and breath short-winded accents of new broils to be commenced in strongs afar remote. No more the thirsty entrance of this soil shall daub her lips with her own children's blood.
Juan, that opera with the Shura Sota, the very first line from Chaucer is made to fit the first line here. And again, the context is completely different, but isn't the echo there when we hear about panting, breath, and strons? Again, not a real common word, but it is capitalized in the first folio as if to draw attention to it. But it occurs in Chaucer, of course. Thirsty, well, we're talking about the land and being daubed with blood. Yuck. But in Chaucer, in the pleasanter context, it was the drought of March, going to be pierced to the root and bathed every vein. It was the leaves that were getting the liquid in Chaucer. Here, it's the bloody context because now we're with Henry IV, and it's grim. And where is Chaucer? Here's his continuance.
No more shall trenching war channel her fields, nor blues her flowerets with the armed hoofs of hostile paces. Those opposed eyes, which, like the meteors of a troubled heaven, all of one nature, of one substance bred, did lately meet in the intestine shock and furious close of civil butchery.
It's odd to think of a war image where horses are trampling on gardens, but maybe we wanted to get that flower in there somehow. Those open eyes of the birds, those are maybe echoed. But best of all, nature. Line 11 in Chaucer gives us nature right in that position. So pricketh hem not your in her courages. Here in line 11, we hear nature again. And it's as if everything is aligned if you just look at the concept of nature, as is ideal in the beginning of Chaucer. But in this context, with Henry IV, everything goes immediately out of whack again into civil butchery, kind of a punning weirdness. And of course, as we know, the chaos goes on for more generations. A little bit more. Henry IV, Part 1. That Gads Hill robbery which seems to echo a scene from Oxford's own rebellious youth. Well, in the play, we're going to rob pilgrims going to Canterbury. Whoa, nobody ever notices this. And they do, but we never hear about those pilgrims. But that's a pretty direct reference, eh? Okay, now we have to get into the dark stuff. Where is Chaucer and why isn't he there? Here is Terry Jones, the member of the Monty Python troupe who knew the most about medieval literature and history. His last book was called Who Murdered Chaucer? And he looks at the he looks through this pleasant vision of Chaucer enjoying his latter years, and no. What we've got is a conquered nation by Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, who is probably urged on by this guy. This is Arundel. Name sound familiar? Might not be related to the enemy of Oxford later on and the traitor, but it's a nice coincidence that this guy was the bastard behind a lot of the evil and the purge that ended up being Henry IV's reign. This guy, I think, was banished too. He seems to have made himself an advisor to Henry Bolingbroke and urged him, yeah, go back, build an army and go back, because this guy wanted to be back in power, and succeeded. He became Archbishop of Canterbury and found himself rounding up a lot of people who he didn't like, who were enemies of the church. Chaucer has written a number of pilgrims like the prioress and the monk who are just not ideal church figures. There are friars and summoners, and they all seem pretty corrupt. So that's awkward. Not every religious figure is bad in Chaucer, but he sure does skewer a lot of the malpractices. This guy maybe is responsible for how Chaucer simply disappears, says Jones. Now you look on the interwebs there and you'll say, yeah, Chaucer died on October 25th, 1400. Nobody knows that. And if the poems can be read interlinearly, while they seem pleasant on the surface, these latter short little poems, that Envoy to Skagen, it seems as if Chaucer might have been in some dire straits. He might have sought refuge. He seems to be poor. We don't know what happens to Chaucer or when. Now, where is Oxford's will? Oh, excuse me. I mean Chaucer's will. Chaucer, he says, has owned 60 books. These are, of course, valuable possessions, but where'd they go? Where is Oxford's library? Oh, I mean, Chaucer's library. What happened to it? It must have been pretty impressive. So this Arundel wanted to silence the critics of the church. He knew there was no one who could match Chaucer. That's why Chaucer had to die, says Jones. There was no one else capable of mobilizing such open mockery, of carrying out such a serious onslaught against the corrupt practices of the established church. He's also associated with the court of Richard II. And when the hawks came back, the doves had to go. Richard's court and Richard himself has been denigrated. Richard was too given to flatterers. Seems like could have been true. But one of the real problems was Richard wasn't into the war. He would have been happy with peace with France. Oh, dear God. He liked the arts. What? He liked music and dancing, and he liked Chaucer. So we couldn't have any of that. We had to crack down. Where is Oxford buried? I mean, Chaucer, why do I keep doing that? We don't know. Oh, yes, we do. Of course. It's Westminster Abbey, Poets' Corner, right? That wasn't established until 1556. So we don't know if he's in there. We don't know what happened to him or whatever. At least he got a tribute much later on. I don't know what to think. There are two possibilities, and maybe both are true. But our Earl of Oxford, was locked up in the Tower after that Vavasor problem. And it seems to me, I remember hearing that someone in Elizabeth's age gathered together some documents, perhaps to honor her ancestry, and got those documents because the Tower was basically an archive, and then presented this collection to Elizabeth. If the Tower was an archive, what was Oxford doing all day long? Whittling or looking at documents? Did Oxford have documents to give him an idea of what more about Chaucer we don't know anymore? That where are those documents? I wonder if that's possible. The other possibility is that Oxford, who sensed that he would be obliterated too, just instinctively knew in Chaucer could pick it up, or just the basic archetype of it all, that is, governments don't like poets and prophets. So, one way or another, it seems to me that Donaldson was right, that Shakespeare is a better Chaucerian than most of the Chaucerians. Oh, one more thing. Now I got this slide from Bonner Miller Cutting, and I just thought it's a brilliant thing to put forth when you have one more thing. That is, and this seems to be mine. I have not read anything about this, and I've looked and searched, and it seems like somebody would have thought this through a little bit more. When Chaucer was a teenager and the wars with France were going on, at Rheims, I believe, he was captured and imprisoned. Edward III paid a ransom to get him back, 16 pounds. And this is maybe only the second record in the collection of Chaucer records that we've got, that he got 16 pounds for a ransom. And even Chaucerians will say, wow, that's a lot of money, because you can measure it in how many archers you could get for that, and archers are the valuable soldiers. 16 pounds. Well, I guess Edward III just realized this young guy has got some talent there. Boy, I'm telling you, he's worth the investment. A teenager. A year ago, 16 pounds in England would have been worth 14,500 plus, or $19,000 for a teenager. How did Chaucer end up in the service of Lionel, one of the royal princes here, and then eventually in the household of John of Gaunt, the most powerful guy, when Richard was still in his minority too? When what we know of Chaucer's supposed background is that his father was a taverner. Chaucer suggests that ancestors made shoes or something like that. But out of the rabble, somehow Chaucer rises to be accompany these princes. So you see where I'm going with this. Do we have another royal bastard from Edward III? Because there are others. He had mistresses. How did Chaucer come to be? And once again, does this somehow echo in the remote chambers of the psyche of our Earl of Oxford? One more dark question. What happened to Oxford's, Chaucer's manuscripts? At the end of the Canterbury Tales, as I see someone has mentioned in the chat, Chaucer appends a retraction of his works. As if written to Arundel and his ilk, Chaucer piously denounces all of his works while establishing a permanent list of them too, because this is a semi-sacred text if you're apologizing for them. But it's a third And a final instance of a kind of a autobibliographical endeavor, with the difference that the final work mentioned is the Book of the Lion, and there's no copy that exists. So what was the Book of the Lion? Chaucerian scholars think it's an early work inspired by another French poet, maybe Mauchat or Deschamps. But why isn't it included in the earlier lists of works? I ask. What if it's last because it was last? And what would the subject matter be of something titled The Book of the Lion? Sounds like an animal allegory concerning kingship. Whoa, that would be scanned and destroyed along with its author. Right? In sum, Oxford had every reason and opportunity to admire and absorb the works of Chaucer. But he also somehow identified with the likely miserable plight of a brilliant court poet, entertainer, creator of living characters, a plight ending in erasure and oblivion. Oxford's only solution? Bury Chaucer and himself in the works and wait for some illumination. All right, let's look at the Q&A. And I was able to glance along a bit about the chat, and I actually revel in the accusation of being geeky about all of this stuff. Some of the questions that came up seems like I got around to answering eventually. So what remains in the Q&A right now yeah, the educational background. I did that one slide there about the grammar school not happening. You're not getting Chaucer, you're not getting falconry, you're not getting Italian art, you're not getting anything that is really of substance and joy in Shakespeare from the Stratford Grammar School. But the nobility, that kind of education, yes. And I think other questions, what would be available? Well, I don't know. I don't remember exactly what Chaucer volume was available. I know that I mentioned these early volumes that are available to Oxford in my article that I mentioned. But clearly, as you saw, Plutarch, the Geneva Bible, and Chaucer, the guy ordered in 15 whatever it was. So he did have his Chaucer. How would a grain merchant in Stratford get one? Let's go on. Was the Canterbury Tales acted on stage? I'm saying and suspecting, and this was a late coming notion in Chaucer studies, that what if we consider the possibility of these presentations by Chaucer at the court of Richard II being performative? And there's a lot of evidence when you read again Chaucer's works that this would have been absolutely delightful entertainment. And it's not just this stilted, I am the god Apollo, blah, 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 but rather it's he is a proto-Shakespearean. He's inhabiting characters. He is reading, I hope not too goofy, in the voice of the wife of Bath and the pardoner and the rest. My mentor, Tom Garbati, used to do this reading of the pardoner where there's a passage he said was, this guy just, he's losing himself. He's going crazy. He's demented. And it was really chilling. And I don't know if that's the case or if the pardoner was just in the Canterbury Tales misinterpreted. But the works of Chaucer do lend themselves to the performance of them. So, yeah, I think even though there's a couple hundred years there, I do still think that that too is going to get our Shakespeare Oxford, all jazzed. As for the politics of John of Gaunt, Chaucer, Arundel, and that batch, I think that the sweeping misery that came in with Henry IV and him letting Arundel to take over and just round up people uh, means that anybody associated with Richard II and his court is going to be in trouble. Now, if the implications at the end there are even remotely possible, that is, I guess I'm implying a Prince Plantagenet, that Chaucer is really related to those princes and the family, then that's going to be even worse. But it wouldn't even require that, because Chaucer, in addition to mocking a lot of church figures, not all of them, the priest is perfectly fine in the Canterbury Tales, but that and a general philosophy of relativism, that there's not just this one hardcore answer to everything and it's the Bible, but rather, we scout around and try to figure out people and their psychology and what they have to say and actually like people. What? That's not going to work during a purge. So I don't even think we need to go into details about, the nuances in John of Gaunt's philosophy and the rest, and John of Gaunt's off the scene anyway. But it wouldn't have done Chaucer any favors to be associated there. A readable, understandable version of Chaucer. I was giving, I was assuming that we live in my own time. And for my class, I was giving out or ordering, or even online, maybe a version of Chaucer, which is the Middle English. And, we had to cope in 12th grade and in college and in grad school. It wasn't much of a problem, but earlier on, it was difficult. These days, geez, give them the Great Gatsby and it's like a struggle. So, a readable, understandable version of Chaucer would be, I have a link online, but it's with my students. There is an online version that gives you interlinear translation. And that's probably the best, because you're not losing the original Chaucer, which lends itself to punning and double meanings and all. Once you modernize it, that all levels out and is gone. So you want the readability, but you also want the original, so you can occasionally check out, is that really the literal translation there? I will, what I'll do is figure out a way to put a link to that thing on a Chaucer page on my website. I didn't do a web page for this presentation, but I'll figure out a way to do that so that you can check out like my intro page on my website for Chaucer and get that link to a good edition. All right, enough of that. Do I think The Old Man in Partridge Tale is like Swift's Strolled Brugs, a chilling vision of life if death is destroyed? Any echoes in Hamlet or other plays? Um, I've never encountered a more chilling, creepy character in any literature. And it seems to be a vision of life if death is destroyed. Yeah, I guess it is, because the guy wants death and it's not there and you can't get it. So it's just going on. The echo in Hamlet would be that consciousness, the hyperconsciousness that you hope you can stifle if you just off yourself. But then the worry is, what if you can't? Your body goes, but the hyperconsciousness remains. That, yeah, would be pretty chilling. A pen name Chaucer. Um, what do you read first? Boy, I don't know. My background was that in 12th grade, my old school English teacher had us given a borrowed, but she gave me a copy at the end of the year, the anthology of English literature, and it did have that, oh, this blessed plot, this England, at the beginning pages. And in the early part of the semester, she said, you know, somewhere in the course of this year, you're going to find someone who you really connect with, some poet or writer who is just it for you. And we started reading things, and I probably looked a little Beowulf, but we got to Chaucer very soon, and I thought, wow, this stuff is really good. I love it. I can't wait to get to the guy who I'm really going to get jazzed about. Turns out it was Chaucer. And I don't know why it wasn't Shakespeare, but I think it's just because everybody was saying, oh, Shakespeare's so wonderful. Yeah, 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 yeah. But Chaucer, it was so cool. So as for pen names, Chaucer, I'm not sure what that would mean, except that the Chaucer name is associated with chaussier, you know, um, shoemakers. And, you know, as I'm going through my blab here, I'm realizing, oh, you know, here's another 5 slides. Shoemakers are really important to Shakespeare. You got that shoemaker guy. Really, he's a wise ass at the beginning of Julius Caesar and disturbing the politicians, making puns all over the place about shoemaking. You've got Henry V's big speech on St. Crispin's Day, and you're thinking, first of all, wow, that was magnificent. And then you're thinking, wait a minute, that was crap. If you can get people jazzed up about an arbitrary saint on a random day that you don't even know, hey, wait a minute, is that October 25th? And that's when they decided Chaucer died, and they completely made that up? Just like 624? Well, okay, that would be scanned. But, but anyway, so Henry V gets everybody completely jazzed up. Yay, let's go get killed for a day that honors the patron saint of shoemakers. So on the one hand, because Shakespeare's always doing 2 things at the same time. On the one hand, it's completely random, and on the other, it might be another tribute to Chaucer, at least the name. All right. Um, what else did I miss? That's the Q&A that I'm seeing here, but I couldn't keep up with the chat, of course. So quickly, if you have any other questions of me, or if I didn't sufficiently answer anything in there, or if I answered at too great a length and you want me to shut up a little bit more, we can go back to wrapping this up. Hmm. Okay. Well, let me give you the final word here. So once again, you can plunge further into this Oxfordian perspective on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, and you'll find all manner of resources and links and nice videos and hilarious stuff. And for most of my commentary today, and somewhere you can visit my website too. You'll find suggested further readings, usually when it comes to the plays, annotated filmographies, and such. Today was a bit of an exception. Thank you very much to the friends of Shakespeare Illuminated.